the Salts Healthcare Discover Series podcast, the podcast for healthcare professionals. Interesting, entertaining, thought-provoking.
Hi, and welcome to the Discover Series podcast. My name's Angie Perrin, and I am the Clinical Education Lead for Salts Healthcare, and I've been a stoma care nurse now for almost 30 years. And this morning, it gives me great pleasure, I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. Morwenna Opie, who is a clinical health psychologist based down in Cornwall. Morwenna, could you tell us a bit about your background, please?
Thank you, Angie. So I've really spent my career specialising in helping people adjust to long-term health conditions, and particularly about how to embed that support within a physical healthcare setting. So I've seen a lot of change actually in the last sort of 20 years or so between that being a very foreign concept to being really quite understood. But it's particularly nice that we will be talking to a nurse audience today, because I think as a group, nurses intuitively understand this, that actually the connection that they're making with their patient is really important in terms of people's health journey.
Yes, absolutely. And what we are going to be talking about this morning is exploring some of those ideas and concepts around the psychological adjustment following stoma formation, and really how we can empower nurses to support our patients through that healthcare journey. So I think one of the first concepts I think is really, really important is, as stoma care nurses, we are often faced with some really difficult conversations when we see our patients in clinic. They perhaps are really, really struggling to come to terms with the whole having a stoma and that living with a stoma. And I think as stoma care nurses, we do provide a great deal of support for them, but we don't have any formal qualifications. So I think we perhaps don't see ourselves as good enough. What do you think about this?
Well, I think what I'm really hoping that we'll get from this conversation today is, certainly perhaps to look at some techniques and approaches that people might be able to take away and think about, but perhaps more than anything, to generate that self-belief and that recognition, that intuitive way of showing up is probably exactly where it's at. Ultimately, I think that people who are struggling need to feel that they are validated, that the way they're feeling is acceptable and normal, and that if they get that experience and are able to feel heard and calm, often the wisdom and the what next naturally evolves. And I suspect that that's a skill that many nurses already have, and it would be lovely for them to realise that and have the confidence to put that into practice with conviction.
There's so much power in that, just listening, isn't there?
So much.
And I think, again, one of the common scenarios that as stoma care nurses that we often see in colorectal nursing especially is an unhelpful thought pattern that some of our patients, perhaps those that have been diagnosed with a cancer and then are subsequently told they need a stoma formed, and they have that connotation that the stoma is very negative. What do you think we can perhaps do as stoma care nurses to alleviate those sorts of feelings? Is there anything that we could do?
Yes. I think we need to start with the recognition that everybody is different, and that the starting point is really to listen and hear people out and not make any assumptions, because sometimes that can lead us astray in our response. But certainly that dynamic you're referring to, that real sense of having felt that you've hit rock bottom and then find that something even harder still is showing up, and that why me dialogue can really show up. And I feel perhaps there are two steps really to think about with that.
Okay.
The one is to really hear it and allow people to have that feeling, because only when they feel safe to do that is there a space, I think, to change. But perhaps from there, it's about turning the why me and being able to say, there is no answer. If there were, I'm sure you've spent so much time thinking about the why me, and if there were an answer, you would have found it. And that's keeping you stuck. How instead do we turn to the question of, well, given that, what next? What's that one beginning step we can start to take? Another technique that can be quite helpful, I think, in the context of this particular area of feeling really stuck is to acknowledge there's a huge part of you that feels that you can't cope with this. There's a huge part of you that thinks that you can't move forward. But perhaps there's a really small part of you that's shown up today, or that's having this conversation, that feels able to begin to take some steps forward. So tell me about that small part. Okay. What's showing there? So that glimmer sometimes can be a real springboard to kind of patient-led self-management, which of course is what we would love to get to.
And I think that self-management is so important for our patients. I think when we're teaching them really early when they have that stoma, just sort of encouraging them just to take on a little bit more responsibility each day is sometimes how we meet our goals.
Absolutely.
To self-manage. And in stoma care, when we think about how we support our patients with some of the issues that they experience, one thing that I have noticed and a lot of patients do experience is this constant feeling the bag. They need to feel that the bag is secure. So you often see patients feeling sort of underneath the belt where the stoma sits to check that it's not leaking. They frequently visit the toilet to check again and double check that they're secure. And I think, what would you say this was? Are there any simple sort of strategies that we can perhaps implement in situations like that?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's of course a very understandable response, isn't it, in those early days and that high anxiety state. And of course, absolutely, when we're very anxious, that we're looking for anything that helps us feel safe, and that checking, repeated checking, is probably giving a little bit of a feeling of safety with all of that. So I think here again we come back to the step one is how to get out of that reactive, just desperately wanting that feeling of safety mode, and supporting people to get really good at getting calm and getting centered. Using some breathing techniques, or really reminding people that right now in this moment, how can we get calm together? Doing a little bit of breathing together actually can be really beneficial, for example. And from there, when we're calm, we're in a much better place to do a bit of problem solving, to begin to let go of all of those what ifs and move towards the well then. Because anxiety is partly about the likelihood of a problem happening, but another really important factor in anxiety is, would I be able to cope if that did happen? And it's that fine line, I think, between pausing and thinking, would I be able to cope? How would I manage? And then drawing a line on that and being able to begin to make a healthy plan and taking those small steps that we were referring to before.
Yeah, and those sort of small steps, I think, are really, really important for someone, maybe if they have some important meeting that they're going to, there are specific steps that, in preparation for these sort of monumental sort of, wedding, or I don't know, just travel. People need to be prepared, don't they? And you mentioned the sort of like what if, and certainly question that we get all the time, what happens? What if my bag leaks? Well, then in preparation for that, we would say you would need to make sure you've got lots of supplies with you, carry a little spare set of kit with you, plan your journey, know where the toilets are, perhaps take a radar key so they can get into different toilets. So often those sorts of things like preparation is key for a lot of our patients.
Absolutely. And it's a fine line though, isn't it, between how long to think about and go over possibilities and not let that become a really kind of anxious loop of rumination that gets to an unsustainable level of anxiety. Exactly. It's finding that balance. So within standard CBT, there's a technique called the decision tree, which reminds us to stop and ask kind of two key questions, really. So the first one is there something I can and I want to do about the thing that's worrying me. And so there's a kind of a yes, no on that. In some cases, there really isn't. And then we're working on how do you let go of the preoccupation, knowing that that preoccupation is uncomfortable and it's not going to help. But if there is something you can do, it's about leaning into that, giving it full attention. As you were saying, if you're going to a meeting, what are the strategies that you can really lean into? What preparation needs to happen? How might you break up that journey? What might you take with you? But then at that point, when that worrying thought shows back up, to be able to say to ourselves, okay, nothing new's come up. I've thought about that. I've done what I can. And now I want to live my life and take that step and roll with this, knowing that I've done as much as I can. And even in a difficult situation, I can still do hard things and sort that out.
As stoma care nurses and obviously experienced nurses, we obviously spend a lot of our time with patients that are really, really struggling. And sometimes for us, that emotional overload can sometimes be very overwhelming. Any strategies that perhaps we can incorporate into our own practice that would help ourselves in our own well-being?
Absolutely. You know, I think the reality is that as nurses, sometimes you're holding space when somebody's really exhibiting some incredibly strong emotions. And it's difficult to do that. It's really difficult to do that. What we can sometimes do is retreat into that very professional mindset a little bit. And sometimes we need to do that to cope, but ultimately that's probably the opposite of what the person in front of you needs, which is for you to be able to stay calm amongst those strong feelings, validate them, but also calm down with that conversation around all of this is very reasonable, but we're not going to be able to think about a way forward until we're able to get calm, because the truth is that that's when our frontal cortex comes back online, when we're calm, when we can start to think, when we can pull the slight positives about the situation and make a plan. Now, in order to be able to sit with those strong feelings and not ourselves as healthcare practitioners get into that slightly panicky, reactive, I just want this to be over feeling, we need to be really skilled ourselves at being able to pull in a state of calm, and that probably means that one of the best things that we can do for our patients is to have our own self-care practice around breathing techniques, meditation, mindfulness, all those skills that really help us sit calmly amongst difficult times and tolerate that discomfort, as well, hopefully, as having a good setup for supervision and being able to talk these things through with people that understand how hard it is.
So my regular yoga sessions are really doing.
They are. Recognise that is in no way, we talk about indulgence, that is actually going to be of benefit to the people you work with, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for this morning, Morwenna. I think I've learned so much, and I think there is so much more that I can implement back into my practice. Certainly, the power of listening is going to be immense. So
it really is key, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was the first of our Discover Series podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. There will be plenty more coming up in the very near future. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe or the follow button now, and the next podcast will automatically go straight into your library. And if you have any ideas for future subjects, please email hello@salts.co.uk.